Ian Harris here to speak with us. He thankfully didn't have to travel too far, just probably came right up the street in Boulder, Colorado. He's the CEO of the Building Energy Performance, and they deploy private capital for energy retrofits, energy efficient retrofits to commercial and industrial buildings. So I'm going to keep my intro short and sweet and turn it over to Ian. So thank you so much.
Okay, just a little bit more introduction there. It's true that I run Building Energy Performance, and we're very proud of our record in terms of doing energy efficient retrofits to buildings. By way of introduction on that, we do that because something close to 50% of the power that we use in this country is related to commercial buildings. And so if you're going to make an impact in that space, you can have an outsized impact by fixing it. Really?
Move it closer up a little bit.
Now, is that any better?
Yeah.
No? Not any better? Okay. How about that? Better? Just about? All right. What I might do is just speak louder as well, see if that actually helps. Right, I feel fully wired up at this point. Okay, so what I was basically saying was that the reason we do energy efficient retrofits to buildings is because it has an outsized impact on our emissions. However, I am actually here as a CCL volunteer. I've been a CCL volunteer now since 2016 when I retired. I also lead the Colorado Conservative strategy, if you like, and that's because there is an insufficient number of conservatives inside CCL. I am one of those. I carry little red, you may have seen these on lobby days. For those of us that have a conservative line, we carry little red badges. It does make a difference, frankly, when we go into those lobby meetings to have that conservative badge on here. If anyone feels that they may be a conservative, please approach me and I shall give you, encourage you to wear a badge, although there will be a small test. As you put up here, I'm a lifelong conservative. I'm also a serial entrepreneur. I believed in climate change the first time it was presented, and frankly, I can't remember when it was first presented. It seems to have been here my entire life. And when I retired, I realized that I had been accepting of climate change my entire life, and I'd done absolutely nothing about it. I started thinking about what I would do. There was a period of absolute despair, first because I'd done nothing for 30 years. Secondly, I wasn't finding any solutions. And eventually I came across CCL, I came across carbon fee and dividend. And it's changed my life, frankly. It gives you a great deal of hope because there is a solution that you can absolutely believe in. So I dedicate quite a lot of effort to this. Now, this presentation is going to be pretty dense, and that's because I hope that the PowerPoint will be distributed afterwards. It has a significant number of references in it, and it's got material that I hope you will use. So we'll go through it, but my apologies for some pretty dense slides. Okay. Moving from a debate to solutions. Well, this is a personal perspective on the change. I observe in the language of climate change or about climate change from some conservative and Republican leadership. I observe there is a change. Where this change is happening, we are clearly opening up a gap between the grassroots understanding and viewpoints around climate change and what the leadership are actually saying. And that gap is an important change, I think, and it's something worth acknowledging and something we should support and something, frankly, we might be able to exploit. In a different context, I've seen this once before. I was a senior partner at the world's largest advisory firm for many years, and I built financial control systems for banks for my sins. And in December 2008, the world changed. It changed for all of us. But for those of us sitting inside the bank, something else had changed. We understood some of the errors that had been made. That was precipitated by a change in language, first by regulators, secondly by the senior staff of those banks. And then over the next 5 or 6 years, as we re-engineered most of the world's banking systems at the absolute cost of billions of dollars, one of the things we saw was that if leadership made a different sound to the thousands of people working in hundreds of countries across millions of branches in banks, then things began to move. And first and foremost, somebody in authority has to make a different sound and do a slightly different leadership. I watch a very similar environment at the moment. In terms of leadership, when leadership starts to make a different sound or use a different language, things do move, but only if everybody else gets hold of that and supports it. And my major job in changing banking systems was to encourage the thousands of people to adopt a different way of doing things, which we frankly did reasonably successfully. Now this presentation, what I want to discuss is what's the evidence for this change, what exactly that change is, what the motivation is for it, what are the actors, who's driving it. We're going to look a little bit at the analysis of Western conservative views, and then finally how we actually support that change. And this is the point where I realize that this is not moving with me. Okay, so what is the change? Well, before we discuss this, we have to look squarely at where we are at the moment. The climate science debate, no surprise here, has literally polarised this country. A chap called David Finch, you may know, writes for National Review, said it perfectly well, I think. Americans are polarised in the worst possible way. Two tribes, not so much united for the love of their own, but hatred of the other. This is the background over the last 15, 20 years in which climate change has been discussed. It's nothing to do with climate change. This has happened in its own vacuum. So we live in fairly interesting times, and climate change is just one of those issues that we face. There's another hero of ours, I think, certainly mine, Katharine Hayhoe, and she's pointed out, I've put it up here, the main reason that people reject science of climate change is because they reject what they perceive to be the solution. In this case, for Republicans and Conservatives, that's total government control, loss of personal liberties, destruction of our economy. The thing is, these things have been inappropriately tied together, and they've been done very, very well. It's highly orchestrated, very much curated. So this is the point at which we start, if you like, what's actually changing. This top quote is my quote. I can't attribute this to anyone. This is my own personal view. Some remain locked, if you like, in an unreconcilable climate science debate. After 20 years, we're still locked in this debate. Many conservatives have quietly stepped out of the room, acknowledged the risk, and are looking for conservative solutions. And the reason I've underlined that is they're looking for conservative solutions. But they have definitely stepped out of the room and started to think about it differently. And we see real evidence of that. We must not let this opportunity pass us by, and that's really why I'm standing up here talking about this. At this particular moment in time, leadership would appear to be ahead of grassroots opinion. It's a very critical moment in time. This is not surprising, frankly. If your worldview over the last 20 years has been informed by strong skepticism about climate change and climate science, fossil fuel employment, US energy security, 100 other things that fall into that, opposition to climate change solutions is kind of wrapped up in a broader package, if you like, of conservative views. In many circles, it's still seen as a sort of article of faith, really, a proof that you're conservative to be opposed to this. We are essentially asking people to reassess a single piece of a carefully curated worldview, which is bound up in things like loyalty to the tribe, respect for authority, obeying tradition. These are highly conservative values, and this issue of climate change is bound up in that, and it's quite difficult to disentangle it. It's not going to be easy, and it is going to take some time, but I'm convinced that it is going to change, and that's, of course, inevitably, it has to change. So, evidence. Well, let me start with this example. This is the American Conservative or Conservation Coalition. There's a caucus in here, the Roosevelt Conservative Caucus. I pulled this straight off the website. It's exemplary, but I think it works. A couple of comments here. Clean energy is an important aspect of environmental stewardship. Climate change is real. and humans have been a contributing factor. This is on a Republican website. In this environment, right now, with this administration, frankly, it's encouraging to see this on a Republican website. We can have a long conversation about this particular caucus and what it stands for and how it works, but this is still published. It's up there to go and see it. All right, arguably, this is the most important slide, which of course is why it has the smallest possible print. Hopefully the slides will be passed out. These are public statements, and they're going to signal change, and they're really my sort of starting point for evidence that there is change. What's interesting about them when you read them later is just note how carefully crafted these statements are. And one of the things they avoid is any debate about climate science to speak of. Looking at the first three of these, very interesting. They essentially acknowledge climate change as either being real or the fact that the climate is changing. They completely avoid the anthropogenic nature of it, the idea that it's us that's doing it. It just doesn't sort of deal with it in those statements. The fourth and fifth ones are interesting for sort of someone else is pointing it out. You know, either other Republicans are saying that there is climate change, or scientists are saying there is climate change. It's interesting, though, isn't it, to see a Republican politician comment that other scientists believe there is climate change. I mean, that is change, frankly, in its own right. The fifth one is my favourite, Pat Roberts, kind of says it all. It's not whether or not we have climate change. Apparently that's obvious. It's what we do about it. After 20 years, I'm glad it's obvious. Yeah. But it's important, right, to get up and say that, and say it's obvious. The real issue here is that moving from climate science debate to solutions is really what's changing here, and the focus on solutions. And that's exactly what Pat Roberts is saying. Yeah, it's happening. Now let's get on with it and figure out what the solutions are. By the way, anybody who's unclear about what the solution is, please see me afterwards, so we can talk about that. Let's get carbon fee and dividend out there. It's a sensible market-led solution. It obviously has its impact on regulation, which is very appealing to conservatives. Essentially, the Conservative leadership with statements like this is giving permission for those that are alarmed or concerned about climate change to actually do something about it and start thinking about solutions. And that air cover should not be ignored. We should take advantage of this. When you talk to a Conservative, take these quotes, print them out, hand them out, learn them, memorize them. This is Conservative leadership saying there is a problem, we need a solution. And that gives everybody else permission. Remember, this is a Conservative way of thinking. The leader says there's a problem. There is now a problem. Last week there wasn't a problem, so there wasn't a problem. But now there is. And it's that straightforward. So you can use these quotes very effectively. But please stay on message. Stay on solutions. Stay out of the climate change debate. We often say there is a risk of climate change. Conservatives historically have been very good at mitigating risks and understand it's less absolute, of course, than there is a fact. And what we really want to do is make CF&D as a bipartisan issue acceptable to Conservatives, which is an easy thing to do. So, motivation, what's driving all of this? Well, it's the data. Oh, gone too far or not far enough? No, I am actually there. As I said, I am an engineer, which means I can't really do anything. So it's the data, right? So looking at the data, from the Yale and George Mason University studies, climate studies, the majority of both parties agree that government must take action to solve this problem. It is an important milestone, and we've only just crept over the line, but it is a majority. That means the majority of people believe that there is something that needs to be done. I think this one's interesting. The Republican consultant, Frank Luntz, his firm, in fairness, he was no longer in the firm when this poll was conducted, so he had left, but it's his name that was associated with this. That poll found that there's 2-to-1 support among GOP voters for the Climate Leadership Council's carbon tax, which is very, very similar to ours. It's really just a question of semantics at some level, but that's a 2-to-1 majority. It's a real fact. It's a good poll. It's done by somebody with no other agenda other than do a good poll, who comes from a strongly conservative background. I guess the next point is it's a demographic time bomb, particularly for the Republican Party. 70% of Republicans now are worried about the fact that the stance on climate change is hurting younger Republican voters. This is a real issue. I've heard, quote, from a Republican that if we don't get hold of climate change, there will be no Republican Party, because it is becoming such a central issue for young Republicans. And to back that up, the same Frank Luntz poll showed that 75% of Republicans under 40 actually back CFD. So it's time to act, and things have to move, and they have to move fairly quickly now. Again, we should not let this moment go by without taking advantage of it. Lastly, it's an interesting issue around trending. Obviously, this stuff gets looked at every year, and last year, 43% of Republican voters said they were more concerned about climate change than they were a year ago. Now, that's a sort of Twitter storm type trending that you need, where almost half the people asked say it's now more important to them than it was a year ago. It's an extremely valuable piece of information because it shows that people are really getting engaged. And we need to give them something to be engaged with. So, other actors in the field. These are the guys that are out in front, essentially the eco-right. I put a list up there. There's actually many, many more of them, but these are things you can subscribe to. If you want to actually understand really what Republicans and Conservatives think about climate change and what the solutions are, these groups are good to get on the mailing list for. There's a couple of individuals that have been out here for a while, names we know, Bob Inglis and Carlos Rebello. These guys are a great personal inspiration to me because they saw it, they tackled it, it cost them everything, their jobs, and in some cases the membership of the tribe, which for individuals that were brought up in it is a very heavy price to pay. And let it never be said that Republicans and Conservatives operate without conscience. It's not true, it's just taking a while to rebalance. This meme, if you like, is borrowed from a young lady called Chelsea Henderson who runs the Republic EN. If you want a really positive, upbeat, full of information email on a sort of bi-weekly basis, I would encourage you to go to the Republic EN site and sign up, because it's entertaining, it's informative, but it's also very positive, which I love about what she's doing. On this meme, by the way, this is exactly how we all see ourselves, a sort of elite, divinely inspired eco-warrior battling great evil. I'm sure everybody sees us that way, but... Okay, a little bit more motivation. So, data is trending, eco-right is active, up and at it. Conservative leadership is moving, I guess, from debate to solution. So what happens next, like all things conservative, will be done in district. 3 years of conservative lobbying has identified a pretty common theme, and it depends a little bit on your political philosophy. So the question you could ask a representative is, what were you sent to Washington to do? And it's possible the answers might be twofold. One, I was sent here to make decisions on behalf of my constituents. Typically, a Democrat may answer it in that way. A Republican is more likely to say, I was sent here to do exactly what my constituents tell me to do, which is a huge difference. Last June, those of us who went, specifically asked a question around CF&D and asked what it would take to get it on the agenda. The answer is very clear. For this to be fully on the agenda, I need constituents to tell me it's an issue. It doesn't mean that the representative doesn't understand it as an issue. It just means that no one ever called the office to say, hey, get on with this climate change thing. It just doesn't happen. There was no single recorded call into the office for Ken Buck, for instance, that we asked. No one's calling in. So we've got to fix that, because these guys are there to do exactly what their constituents tell them to do. If ever there was an organisation that was well suited to galvanising grassroots support to get people to call in to their representatives at CCL. Okay. Leadership is essentially providing space for reassessment and reflection in the grassroots. If we use this opportunity, as I am encouraging everyone to do, if we push too hard, we will not be heard. As you know, change will take longer if you push hard. Anyone who's got teenagers, I think, understands this process. What do Conservatives actually want out of this conversation? Well, one of the things they want is they want to challenge the false narrative that Conservatives do not value the environment. I can tell you that I've heard this. It is an idea, and almost a paradigm, and it's probably well deserved if you listen to certain media outlets, but for the most part, it's not really true. So that needs to be challenged and rebalanced. They want to take back, own, lead the issue of climate change. Everybody wants to be at this particular party, but there's no space for it. It is owned utterly, in some ways, by the left-hand side of the political spectrum. And while that may not be fair, or who cares how we got here, if we want a solution, if we need to get a bipartisan bill through, we need the right-hand side of the political spectrum to feel like they own it as well. And to that extent, they're focused on solutions, and they will be focused on conservative solutions. They want to promote local stewardship as an answer. In conservative life, everything is local. It's all about your next-door neighbour. It is not done at a federal level. The federal level is sometimes distrusted. They want to promote the free market. They want to preserve economic growth. And we want innovation as opposed to regulation. The wonderful thing about CF&D is how often it aligns perfectly with all of these requirements. So I would encourage you to work out how CF&D meets those values, and if there is any concern or confusion about that, come directly to me. We can provide information that will help you with those conversations. Well, I'm a consultant by training, so eventually there had to be some kind of matrix in here. A pretty dense slide, I appreciate. So here are the stats. This is from the Yale climate model, and I know it's from 2016, so the data is relevant, but it's getting tired, to say the least. Before we go into this data, I want to give you a health warning with some of it. If you're using it, you will be talking to Conservatives. This data was produced by an elite, arguably left-leaning university, and it's calculations, it's estimates. It's not direct polling in some cases. And while it is not necessarily wrong, its source sometimes can be questioned, and that's something to bear in mind. So this is indicative to give you an idea and support to take this forward, but you can't slam it down on the table as some kind of fact, because if you were poll a particular local district, you might find the numbers to be slightly different. But it's not wrong, just be careful of its source. So let's look at the slide. The left-hand side is the questions, only some of them that were asked in that climate study. And then I put our states in for this region across the top. And then on the right-hand side, there's a sort of national average as some kind of, I guess, barometer of how this pans up against it. So have a look at your state and look at the numbers in those states. You'll see that they're pretty similar. The West behaves consistently in the same way, which is actually good, because if we can crack it, it means we crack it for all. Look at the green, we've got green boxes, and this is really the demonstration of the change that's happening. So I'll start with the green boxes, if you like. Probably half of Republicans that some kind of climate change is happening. Against, this is 20% down on a national average. So it's not a great report card, but it's better than nothing, and it's where we're starting from. The next few lines are less encouraging. Only a third think it's either caused by humans, believe that scientists think it's happening, they're either worried about it, or that it will harm anyone in the US. Only a third of people believe this. This is, it's not great, and it's markedly different from what the national average is.
Is the national average Conservatives or all people?
All people, yeah, and that's why it's so different. Yeah, it's comparison of Republican voters to everybody. However, if we look at the blue zone, we ask a slightly different question. Should we fund research into renewables? Same people, same answer, or same people asked a different question. 3/4 of registered Republicans say, yes, we should fund research into renewables. Wait, this is Republican voters suggesting we use tax dollars for government to invest in research. It sounds incoherent when you put it next to the, do you actually believe in climate change? And that's because it's changing. So if you get off the climate science debate and get on to solutions, it turns out that 3/4 of the people you're going to be talking to actually think the government should fund some kind of research into renewables. Even more bizarre, regulate CO2. Half of registered Republicans answer to this question, well, yes, actually there should be some kind of regulation, which is odd, because for the most part, we Conservatives don't like regulation. But we clearly are looking for solutions. Now, being sceptical about climate change has been part of Republican identity for 20 years. It's locked in. It's sort of part of a larger conservative worldview. If we start talking about the risks of climate change and asking different questions about renewables, about solutions, then we get a very, very different answer. And that's because that debate is being moved deliberately by leadership. Okay, supporting the change. Well, the first thing you can do, of course, if you feel up to it, is to provide full-throated support for conservative leadership for the new publicly held positions. I was hoping Nick Huey would stay here. He had to leave earlier on, but I just wanted to point out that a perfect example of what happened there. Mitt Romney has made a very clear statement about the fact that climate change exists and we actually have to do something about it. And Nick did exactly what CCLs are supposed to do, which is to galvanise a whole bunch of people, get out there and produce support, very, very clear public support. In this case, it was a giant #M at a football stadium with everybody wearing purple hats, I think. But it made a difference because it makes it clear to the representative, to the politician, that there are people out there who say, yes, that's actually the right thing to say. So regardless of political leaning, when somebody says something, don't step back and say, well, I'm going to dissect that statement because it doesn't really mean what it means. Just say, great. If they're using words like climate change exists and here's a solution, and support it. Write an LTE, say, well done. It'll help a lot move that debate forward. We essentially have some air cover, and now we need to take that air cover, use it and get into districts. We need to show how CF&D aligns with conservative values. We need to move that conversation forward. What I would suggest is introduce carbon fee and dividend into a Republican district in every which way you want with your friends or colleagues or an Elks Club or whatever it is, and just allow it to sit. If you think about how that transition has got to happen from 20 years of climate science debate ending in essentially it's not happening to here's an actual solution, stay off the climate science debate, just let it sit and see how that comes back. It will take a while for that to, if you like, be reflected upon. There's another point in here, and I've done it myself in this presentation. I've used sarcasm because it's funny. And it is funny. If it wasn't so tragic that 20 years of climate debate is suddenly it's obvious, I think it is funny. But when you're out there, we can't use this. We have to take it seriously. And so there can be no sarcasm in this conversation. And welcoming people to a late party isn't going to help change everybody's mind. So as much as I've just done it, I implore you not to, where you can possibly do it. And then the last one is for the representatives and people who support them, try to respect the challenges that these guys face. You know, think about what happened to Cabela and how Bob Inglis has gone through that journey. These guys are primary. You heard Danny talk about it just now. The political landscape for a Republican is that the primary is way harder to get through than the actual election itself. And so they have serious problems. And for them to stand up and say even small increments means they're going to get flack, for sure. So give them some support, give them some understanding in that space. I don't know if Phil's here, but I love this map, so thank you, Phil. We have 10 Republican representatives, 7, if you like, senators. There's a huge rural-urban divide, no surprise to anybody from any state. And really the whole point of this, looking at this map, is that here's our target audience, and I just want to be sure that we get it. This has to be done in district. We can continue to go to DC, and we should. But until someone calls into that office in DC and says, hey, get on with the climate change thing, it's not effective. And so we need to do both. And if we do both, it will be very effective, because some of these guys are almost binary in their response to what constituents want. All right, so the plan. So Colorado is blessed with a few conservatives that are CCL members, and a few more actually that are very willing to participate in the conservative strategy, and I'm very grateful for it. Here's the priorities of what we're trying to do in Colorado for now. Number one, recruit, retain, and activate conservatives. At the end of the day, it's the top of the list. It's what needs to happen, because without it, we can't get any of this done. There are 1.3 million Trump voters in our region which are either alarmed or concerned by climate change. I'll spare you how I got to this number, but I can show you if you're interested. But it's worth taking note that there is 1.3 million people out there that potentially you can engage in this conversation with, and we should be doing that. We are focused on trying to introduce CF&D through speaking engagements into Republican districts. We've set up a bit of a team. It seems to be working reasonably well at the moment. We've identified just over 200 conservative organizations, all in Republican districts, and we're working hard to essentially get speaking engagements. Part of me hopes we're wildly successful. Part of me is terrified if we are, because they're all spread out all over the place. They're pretty rural. If that process works in Colorado, if we can actually get regular ongoing speaking engagements in conservative organizations, I think we could make a case for taking that to other states now that we've got the process set up and the team set up to do it. I guess my ask, ultimately, is identify conservatives in your state that you know. Connect them with me. Send them to me. We'll talk about what that really means to be part of the Conservative Caucus, how we can act, what the strategy is for that state. We've got 7 states, and I think there's a great deal of opportunity, given the change that we're seeing, to leverage that change and essentially get more conservatives retained, activated, and ultimately calling into representatives' offices and saying, I've heard about this solution to the risks of climate change, and I'd like you to do something about it, and I'd like you to do it now.
Repeat that. That was perfect.
It's on the video. Okay, well, that's the end of the presentation, so I guess we're on to questions if we wanted to answer anybody. Are we running mics? Yep, as you see fit.
That was excellent, by the way. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
I was wondering if some conservatives are unwilling to reach out to their elected officials or write LTEs due to the concern around groupthink. I know, as you mentioned, a lot of conservatives, the majority do believe in climate change or are concerned about it and want a solution, but they also say when they only like 10% of conservatives think other conservatives are concerned. So they are afraid to potentially speak up about that. What are your thoughts on that? And I don't know, when you go around to conservative groups, you bring that up, that hey, a lot more people are concerned about this, even if you don't realize it. So don't be afraid to speak up.
Yep, well, you are exactly right. Exactly right, it's a huge problem. If you ask someone in the privacy of a poll whether they believe in climate change, turns out 51% say yes. If you ask someone in a bar, hey, do you believe in climate change? You have beer thrown at you. Completely. The coverage you've got now, and this is why this moment is so important, if you take those quotes with you in the back pocket, they're not quotes from, not to say that the quotes that we've received in the past from retired individuals who were party grandees aren't valid, but these are serving politicians who are fighting for re-election and about to run through a primary. So if they're saying this, you should just give me 2 minutes on the solution. Not on climate change, on the solution. There's a risk. We got that. There's a risk. Apparently it's obvious. Go with the, here's a solution, and then we can help with this. This is why this is a conservative solution. It has all the right attributes. It's a market solution. It removes, it's a regulation. It doesn't detract from your liberties. There's a quite strong argument, but you're absolutely right. People are afraid to speak up, often in the Commonwealth of Labourers, and these guys are giving you permission and bandwidth, and Republicans bandwidth, to reconsider that position. Actually, right at the back, the gentleman in the blue was we're in the back left-hand corner. I'm attempting to make a fair assessment of the room.
I've had numerous discussions with different groups about this, and I think one of the problems is even the labels of conservative and liberal are losing their meaning. If you were asking me 10 years ago, I might be able to describe what a conservative is. If you ask me now, I'm not sure if I could answer that question. It becomes more individual rather than policy-driven. And so, without getting into names, it just seems like there's a change in the dynamic where you could say conservative, but when someone who's in that mindset says the word liberal, it becomes a derogatory. And so I think there's a problem with the tribe and how we're using even our labels, and it's actually detrimental to our discussion.
I do agree. I think it's the times in which we live, particularly here, although we're not immune, the rest of the world is not immune to this. Essentially, we are here to fight climate change. We have defined, CCL, that the way we do this is right through the middle. And ultimately, if we stay off the language and stay on the solutions, that's all we can do. I do agree with you, but it's a problem much bigger than climate change. Or no, it's probably not bigger than climate change. It's a problem that's to the left and right of climate change. But our journey is utterly bipartisan, it's straight through the middle. And so we stay off this rhetoric and focus on solutions to what the leadership is saying is clearly a problem. I think that's what we can do. We put it down, leave it there to sit. Lindsay, I think you better make the decisions from now on. You make the decisions about who gets the mic.
One topic that I haven't heard you address is the military and the defense. And generally, conservatives are more, in broad terms, pro-military, pro-robust defense. And I haven't seen you kind of address how CCL might put forward that argument that this solution would be, is in line with some of the military and defense goals that, our military leaders have put forward.
You're right, I didn't put it in this presentation. It does come up quite a bit. I mean, the biggest, energy independence means different things to different people, and some people it means maintaining oil corridors around the world at, frankly, any cost. I think the military part of this is, first of all, let me say, if you want more information, I'll give you an answer. If you want more information, we'll give you more information to answer that question. So that's available, and we can certainly do it. But broadly speaking, the military has a very clear view of climate change. It actually sees it as an incredible risk to our national integrity. They've written extensively about this, and they have a huge bill to deal with it. They're worried about global migration that's going to come from this. So the military is concerned, and anybody who believes in the mission and integrity of the military should believe the military when they say climate change is an issue. And we can provide information that will help back that up. More controversially, of course, is oil corridors and the wars we fought to maintain that oil. There's some fabulous movies that have been put together for that, and if you haven't seen them, I bet Trevor knows the answer to this. Can you remember that movie that was produced about 2 years ago about oil security? If anyone can remember it, please tell me the name. But it's a fabulous piece of documentary evidence that really just talks about why we've gone to war and the way we've gone to war, the price we've paid to maintain those oil corridors. It's worth watching. there is plenty of material, and so you're absolutely right. It is an absolute way to initiate a conversation with a Conservative. I would do it incrementally, though, because some people have some very different views about why we've done what we've done.
So, the mention of, when you mentioned that this is part of a much bigger divide, that the divide on climate is the tip of an iceberg, if you will, of a much bigger divide. It made me think of one of our approaches of CCL generally is, to try to make climate a bridge issue rather than a wedge issue. Can you speak to that in the context of conservation, or conversations, with Conservative representatives?
Yes, I can speak to it. Let's see. I don't think you're going to get a Danny-style answer, though. It's probably not as erudite. I think the issue with this is that things are highly polarized. And you could believe, if you watch television, that everything is polarized all the time. Interestingly, climate change, in my opinion, is becoming one of those things which is oddly less polarized. And I think the offer of the bridge issue is an olive branch. I think it's something that has to be offered very gently, but it's something that has to be offered nonetheless. And it's something, again, stay off the science. We don't necessarily have to agree that climate change is happening. We can agree, however, that there is a risk of climate change, and we can agree that there are solutions, and that some solutions are better than others. And that the bridge issue is to work together to agree, like we used to, on a nice packaged compromise that is actually a workable solution. So it does work as a bridge issue, in my opinion. But you have to remind people that's the way we used to do business, that we're focused on the solution, not arguing about what the problem is. And frankly, this is the issue for most politics, right? That if you spend your time arguing about whose fault it is, you get absolutely nowhere. The thing exists now, and then we've got leadership saying that it exists, and we need to do something. So if we're offering up solutions, let's talk about those solutions as though we're all party to crafting that solution. And I think that is what drives the bridge rather than the division.
I understand, and I heard you say now, talk about the solutions. The question is, how do you talk about the solutions when somebody is dismissive of the problem?
Yeah, it's a really good question. What they're going to have to do now, this is nuanced. What they're going to have to do now is say something like, Mitt Romney doesn't know what he's talking about when you hand that, or Pat Roberts is, smoking something. They're going to have to respond to an actual quote from senior leadership of the party who is very clearly saying that there is something wrong. And so start with the quotes, use the quotes over and over and over again. That's what they're there for. They're very carefully crafted, but use them. Because, okay, you don't believe in climate change. I understand. This guy, someone you would potentially vote for, does, or at least is worried enough that they want to put in place solutions. And so what I want to talk to you about is that this guy believes it, and that we need to figure out what solutions are in place. And if we don't figure out what solutions to do, guess what? Those solutions will be defined by the party that is in power, or the one that's talking about it or working on it. And so we need to find a bipartisan solution that works for everybody. And that's when you start talking about how CF&D essentially has Conservative values built into it. But start with the quotes. This is the big change, is hand those quotes out, give them a flyer, check it out, look at the websites.
I just wanted to amplify the point that the gentleman in the corner made about the definition, what is the meaning of a conservative? I'm trying to reconcile the poll numbers that you are telling us about, which are very encouraging. A certain percentage of GOP voters believe this is true, believe this is happening. I'm trying to reconcile that with my own experience with GOP voters. And I'm wondering if we're talking about the same group of conservatives, we're talking about the same group of people. The folks whom I know personally don't look to Mitt Romney or Mitch McConnell as thought leaders. Those aren't opinion drivers. They're looking to Laura Ingraham and Sean Hannity as their opinion drivers. So I guess the problem that I'd like you to maybe suggest a solution to is, where do we go to find the climate conscious conservatives in our community? I'm honestly not sure where I would go to find them.
Well, yeah, you and I oddly have the same challenge. Let me answer this in two ways. Conservative leadership has started to make clear, unambiguous statements about climate change and the search for solutions. I don't think this will stop. This is the list I got today. If I come back in a month, I anticipate there'll be more of this. And where these guys go, they're in charge, right? They're not completely in charge, they're not the president, but they're pretty much in charge. And when they start moving the needle, other people will follow. There will be rancorous debate, frankly, about this within conservative ranks, but they are making a change, and they have to make a change. And the reason they have to make a change is that none of the younger Republicans are going to vote for them unless they do make the change. So it's coming whether they want it or not. Unfortunately, not necessarily because of climate change, but because no one's going to vote for them. But that's the nature of politics. But it is going to change. So why don't we watch to see what Sean's saying in 6 months' time or a year's time? There is a gap here that's opening up, and I'm saying we're at the very start of it. Watch the space closely, support it as far as we can go. To your actual point about where do we find conservatives who are alarmed by climate change, well, our strategy is to continually give bipartisan CF&D conversations to conservative clubs. Typically, in an audience of 50 people, there might be one person at the end of that who sneaks up at the end and goes, "Oh, actually, I was hoping you'd come along. Can I get a card or something?" And it is that sort of, that's how we're doing it. And that's what you're looking for. So you have to keep putting it out there, and it's a numbers game, and eventually someone is going to come back to you. And this is the point, leave the door open. Just put it out there, leave the door open, leave a card, leave contact details, something. You might be surprised over the next year how many people reach out and start talking to you privately. It's like the bar example I gave. You know, don't ask him in the bar, get wet.
We get time for one more question.
Would you like it, Trevor? You had your hand up.
I was going to respond, but you kind of already talked.
Okay. Well done.
I'm a conservative, and I'm not a Republican, and I wonder how you might talk to the group about understanding that there's a philosophy and then there's a political party. And I find that sometimes it's really hard to say you're a conservative in this room because you get demonized as a Republican.
Well, I got, how long have I got to finish? Let me say very clearly, I mean, the reality is that the political spectrums on both sides are highly polarized, and really there are some extremes. If you were in the Democratic Party, you could be labeled as a socialist very easily at this point in time, inaccurately, I think, but nonetheless. There is a huge difference between conservatism and people who have been conservatives all their life, which would include me, and being, if you like, a card-carrying holder of a particular party, the Republican Party. They overlap. It's a Venn diagram, right? There's a lot of common ground. But ultimately, political parties are pretty tribal. And so the reason I use the word conservative so often is because in certain circles, Republican is a loaded word, as it is liberal, to the gentleman's point back there. It's used in a pejorative way. This difference is, it's important to recognize, but I think the term is, if we're Republican, it's because we're registered and we vote Republican, often, regardless of what's on the ballot, loyalty to tribe, obedience, that kind of stuff. If we're a conservative, I think we lean on a heavier history of American conservative thought, which goes back kindly a couple of hundred years, which includes conservation in that term. I think the different things, I think we tend to label ourselves as conservatives for the most part. How we vote, whether we're on the left or the right, is our business. How we identify ourselves, and I would tell you here, I'm a fiscal conservative who has certain social liberal tendencies. And that's how I define myself, and many, many CCLers are the same way. How I vote is none of your business. And I guess we would separate the two. So I define myself a conservative. I don't know if that helped, but that's how I see it.